Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's program. Seyfarth and ACC Northeast present Navigating Workplace Flashpoints in the New Presidential Era. All participants are in listen-only mode. You are encouraged to submit questions throughout the program using the Q&A feature on WebEx. However, if your question is not answered during the session, our presenters will follow up with you directly in the coming days. For those of you interested in CLE credit, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation. Please write this code down as it will not be repeated and is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and materials will be distributed to attendees following the presentation. Now, I'll pass it over to our presenters for today's program, Dawn Soloway and Abby Skinner.
Thanks, Andy, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this presentation today on navigating workplace flashpoints in the new presidential era. I'm Dawn Soloway. I'm a partner here in our Boston office at Seyfarth, and I am the co-chair of our Cultural Flashpoints Task Force. I'm also an employment trial and appellate lawyer and employment counselor. And I also want to introduce my colleague, Abby Skinner. Abby is an associate here in our Boston Labor and Employment Group and also a member of our Cultural Flashpoints Task Force. Next slide. So today, in today's agenda, we're going to cover what do we mean when we talk about cultural flashpoints. We're going to talk about the sort of renewed energy that we're seeing in 2025 in existing flashpoints. Some practical tips on what do employers do now. And then we're going to spend a few minutes talking about how Flashpoints litigation is different and how Flashpoints investigations are different and some best practices around both of those topics. Next slide. We always like to start our Cultural Flashpoints content with just a couple of quick notes about how this is inherently, by definition, sensitive content. So we're going to be talking about viewpoints that are inherently polarizing. And so just please know that we approach these issues as neutral legal advisors. You're certainly not going to hear any viewpoint on any of these flashpoints that is either my viewpoint or Abby's or that of Seyfarth Shaw. Instead, our intent is to help you to develop your own framework around flashpoints and your own best practices for handling these flashpoints as they erupt. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by cultural flashpoints? This is a term that we invented, and I have to say I'm quite proud when we get calls from clients saying, I have a flashpoints question, because that is a term that we kind of coined in 2023 when we developed this task force. And the reason that we developed this task force is that we were seeing across the country that employers were increasingly wrestling with the fact that polarization that exists out in the world was increasingly coming inside the workplace. And there's lots of different reasons for that, right? One is that there are no longer these hard boundaries between what's at work and what's not at work. People work remotely or in hybrid settings. People bring their phones to work and have access to those phones all day long. People are Facebook friends with their work colleagues. And so those lines that maybe used to exist where, you kind of come to the parking lot and walk inside the office and try to leave politics aside really doesn't resonate in today's world. And so our goal was to help clients to navigate those flashpoints, whether in politics or culture, COVID wars, global conflicts, and find a way to both lower the temperature in the workplace so that people are all feel included and feel that they can bring their whole self to work, but also kind of focus on the business mission. One of my areas of expertise is religious accommodation and discrimination, and so that's one of the reasons that I was brought into this task force. But we have people from sort of across the country in different specialties who come together to help think about the best way for employers to navigate these issues, defend litigation if it comes to that. And so that was sort of the genesis of our group. Now, I said that we invented it in the middle of 2023. That seems like a lifetime ago, frankly, in Flashpoints, because not long after we founded it, the world experienced October 7th. And we had just a deluge of questions around polarizing, viewpoints and social expression and social media activity arising out of October 7th and the war that has ensued. Certainly, we knew that the 2024 presidential campaign would be polarizing. Perhaps we underestimated just how polarizing that election would turn out to be. I sometimes was asked last fall, do you think there'll still be flashpoints in 2025? And we all thought, yeah, I'm pretty sure that there will be. And certainly that has played out in spades. Next slide. So what types of cultural flashpoints do we mean, and what do we kind of include in that term? Certainly polarizing viewpoints about politics. We're seeing that certainly right now with the flurry of activity from the administration and resistance to that activity or opposition, legal challenges to it. Like I said, global conflicts, the Israel-Hamas war, but also the Russia-Ukraine war, and other global conflicts. We see flashpoints around social movements, whether it be Black Lives Matter or Me Too. We see polarizing issues around religion, particularly when religion sometimes comes into conflict in the workplace with gender identity, bathroom policies, LGBTQ initiatives, Pride Month. We continue to see polarization around COVID, even all these years later, whether it be around mandatory vaccination policies, which now, we used to be only talking really about COVID and flu, and now we're starting to talk about MMR and measles, return to work disputes. All of these things are the kinds of polarization that we know that our clients are seeing inside the workplace and that are increasingly turning into litigation. Next slide, please. And I think I actually neglected to say on that slide, DEI programs, which certainly is one of the hot button issues of the day and which we'll touch on in more detail today. So one of the approaches that we take when we're guiding our clients on cultural flashpoints is to help them develop what we call the Flashpoints framework. And that's really finding a way forward, each institution for itself, because there's no one size fits all answer to this, where they're really on any given flashpoint looking at kind of the intersection of a couple of different things. One is legal compliance. So what does Title VII say, which is the non-discrimination statute, of course, and the state law analogs to Title VII. What does the National Labor Relations Act say? What does state laws say, for example, about political activity or captive audience laws? And increasingly, and we'll talk about this a little more later in the presentation, but the executive orders are, of course, on everyone's top of mind in terms of part of the legal landscape. But it's not just the legal landscape. It's also, what are your institutional values? What do your policies say? What is your business mission? Because those are going to be front and center when you think about kind of a way to navigate toward through flashpoints. And also, kind of your employee population and your workplace culture. So, what's the best outcome for your morale, for attracting the best talent, for keeping people engaged, for keeping people focused on the work and not on some of the more distracting, polarizing issues of the day. And retaining the best talent, having people feel like they can bring their whole selves to work, and feel respected, but also not be kind of engaged in a lot of internal conflict with each other. And the idea here is to develop for yourself, for your own organization, a path forward that is proactive and thoughtful and calm and consistent. Because if you don't have that kind of framework, what we find a lot of times happens is that companies are kind of reacting to the flashpoint of the moment, right? So let's say one of your employees says something very polarizing on social media, a different employee sees it, they screenshot it, they bring it into HR, they say, I can't believe that John in accounting has said this terrible thing, I can't work with him anymore, may tell other employees. And, and of course, in today's world, things that are on social media can go viral and can get associated with your organization very quickly online. And if you have an existing framework a way to think about how to deal with these issues, a sense of what your own policies say. You have a core constituency within your organization that is equipped to handle these flashpoints. You're going to be in a much, much better situation to manage whatever is erupting with less stress and more kind of thoughtful, proactive way forward. Next slide, please. So certainly in 2025, we are seeing, I would say, more flashpoints than ever. The existing ones that we were working with in 2023 and 2024 are still present, but there is really a renewed energy around these flashpoints. We obviously have a very closely divided country. We have a new administration that is acting daily, sometimes hourly, to affect really sweeping changes, and a really furious opposition to that new administration, legal challenges, global conflicts that are continuing to rage on. And, you know, we live in an environment of really kind of screaming headlines in all directions. And it's not possible to keep those forces outside of the workplace. You know, occasionally I'll hear a company say, well, we really don't want to do training on flashpoints because we don't want to bring that polarization, you know, into the workplace. Well, the reality is that it's already there. Because there's no employee in any organization that doesn't have viewpoints, often strong viewpoints on these issues, and they intersect inherently with protected classifications. And so rather than kind of have a head in the sand approach, we really recommend understanding that there is that polarization inside the workforce, and instead trying to be proactive about it. You know, one thing that we're also seeing is that, you know, perhaps in 2023 or 24, these issues were really sort of more something that HR or in-house Labor and Employment Council were thinking and worrying about. Now we're seeing that it's really grabbed the attention of the C-suite and the executive leadership. And if we're doing a Flashpoints training, often the CEO wants to be there and wants to be part of the institutional response and approach to Flashpoints, because it has become, you know, heightened risk, and it has become, you know, kind of the front page of the New York Times. And so it's kind of grabbed the attention of all different levels of leadership within our employer clients. Next slide, please. So, you know, we could probably have 10 slides on 2025 flashpoints, but we're sort of trying to highlight some of the top ones that we're seeing. Obviously, the new administration and the executive orders are getting a ton of attention these days, as well as international conflicts. We've certainly seen, particularly in recent weeks, a lot of public, you know, commentary about the administration's immigration actions. Those are getting a lot of social media attention, legal actions. We are anticipating travel bans similar to what we saw in the first Trump administration. Those certainly intersect with national origin, race. A lot of flashpoints around gender affirming care and transgender rights, bathroom issues, debates around DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, which we'll touch on a little bit more later, and a growing kind of general anti-corporate sentiment that is affecting many, many workplaces around the country, as well as continuing kind of lingering disputes around COVID, and in particular, the return to in-person work. You know, we're certainly seeing that in the federal government, but also in the private workplace. And these really are just a few of the flashpoints that we are seeing and expect to continue to see in 2025. Next slide. So everyone is thinking and talking about DEI. I imagine that most people in this audience are giving some fresh thought to their diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. And I think it's fair to say that employers have really never been so much on the defensive with regard to DEI programming as they are now. And while a legal analysis under Title VII and other non-discrimination laws is still a driving touchstone of any kind of risk assessment around DEI, that's now sharing focus with the practical risk, right, of being targeted or investigated by the federal government, including the potential impact on clients from any kind of public attack, really regardless of the underlying legality of any of the DEI initiatives. And DEI itself, because of the sort of near constant headlines, is a polarizing topic that can easily become a workplace flashpoint, because every one of your employees probably has a strong view on DEI initiatives. And even that term has become so loaded and politicized and polarizing that it means different things to different people. In general, there are two kinds of risks to consider in the DEI space from a Flashpoints point of view. And I want to emphasize that, you know, to cover all of the changes in the DEI landscape would go well beyond the hour that we have here today. And so really we're kind of approaching this for today's program in terms of flashpoints. So, you know, how does the polarization around diversity, equity, and inclusion manifest as a flashpoint inside your workplace? So generally, from a legal point of view, there are really two types of risks to consider. One is the legal and compliance risk based on the current federal laws, including Title VII and Section 1981, but also the very real reputational and legal target risks, which focus on the risk of being targeted for litigation or for investigation by the federal government, whether that's by the White House, the EEOC, the DOJ, or by private plaintiffs. And any and all of this becomes almost immediately very highly publicized, including being the subject of social media campaigns by, for example, groups that are working actively against DEI initiatives. And other risk considerations include federal contractor status, oversight by a federal agency or a highly regulated industry, and then culture and employee advocacy issues and concerns, as well as concerns that go beyond to customers who may be motivated to engage in boycotts, or investors, or in the higher ed context, students or parents or alumni. So really lots of different constituencies that can contribute to reputational risk in this space. Next slide. So, I mentioned up front that when it comes to flashpoints, that there is no one size fits all answer. And that's, we see regularly that we get calls from clients raising similar flashpoints scenarios, and two different clients will come to completely different decisions about how they're going to handle that flashpoint. And that's appropriate, because there is no right answer, and because what's right for one organization, say a large multinational organization, private company, is not going to be the same thing as what might work for a smaller nonprofit. In the DEI space, what that risk assessment looks like is, for example, thinking about whether your institution is going to be one of the companies in the news who's reported to have stood up to the attacks on DEI, or one that has rolled things back. And different organizations are going to have a different viewpoint on that. Even people inside your institution may have very different viewpoints on that. And so one goal of thinking back to that framework and kind of the intersection of the policies, the legal risk, reputational risk, your organizational mission, is to try to get everybody in the organization who are the key stakeholders on the same page as to that risk assessment. And making sure that your institution has sort of unified messaging about DEI. So ensuring that the right people are looped in. And, if, for example, in the employee resource group space, which is one of the, areas of inquiry in the DEI space, if you want to be communicating clearly internally as to what your policy is or isn't with regard to employee resource or affinity groups, for example. As I said, many employers in the current moment are taking the opportunity to review their DEI programs. And a lot of organizations, probably many on this call, went through this kind of audit or review process back in 2023 or 2024, which is actually great and does give you a head start if you've already begun thinking about these issues. But clearly we're in a new landscape in 2025, new threats of government investigations. And so it really has become a best practice for institutions to look again at their DEI program. What you see on the screen is kind of a process map of how we would recommend that employers go through that DEI audit. And we will often look at alternative options based on what your organization's level of aggressiveness or risk tolerance is. So, for example, on employee resource groups, we might identify sort of the most conservative approach, a moderate approach, and a more aggressive approach. And that is something that your internal sort of whoever your stakeholders are can look at to determine where do we fit on that spectrum of conservative to aggressive. We might look, for example, in doing that audit at, what do your public facing website and documents say? What are you doing about employee resource and affinity groups? And what does your charter look like, or your written guidelines for those groups? And P.S., if you don't have a charter or written guidelines for those groups, that's something that you would want to adopt. We would look at your hiring and your retention goals. How do you go about sourcing new talent? What kind of acceleration or leadership programs do you have in place? What sort of training do you have? There's a lot of emphasis on the content of training. So, not just do you have anti-discrimination training or unconscious bias training, but what actually is being taught in those programs and who is invited to those programs? What kind of internships and fellowships do you have? What kind of acceleration or kind of internal networking programs do you have? And then, once we've kind of gathered those pieces, we would look at whether and to what extent the organization wants to implement changes based on kind of how they're balancing potential risk against how deep their commitment is to diversity, equity, and inclusion principles. Thinking about what is the potential for backlash from shareholders or partners, employees, clients, other stakeholders, and also what is the efficacy of the DEI program that you have had, which things are especially impactful, and how can you update them to meet the moment and minimize risk. We're also seeing increasingly polarization around DEI, creating flashpoints in other ways. For example, in the employee resource group space, there are sometimes, especially with the current kind of push toward making sure that those employee resource groups are open to everyone, you sometimes will have employees kind of going to different ERGs, sitting in the audience to sort of monitor what each other is doing, or trying to claim that, like, well, how come that ERG gets to do this and our ERG doesn't? And so that's one example of how the current DEI moment may sort of manifest itself in a cultural flashpoint. We've seen, for example, allegations that where an employee says that somebody in the company who's newly hired or who's just been promoted is a DEI hire. That's obviously a very polarizing term that we all heard a lot about in the last election. And that is increasingly, as that language is out there in society and it's in the campaign and it's on social media, it leaks into the workplace and may be a violation of your anti-discrimination or anti-harassment policy, depending on the facts. We're seeing a lot of flashpoints about DEI on Slack or Jabber or on company intranets where people are voicing their views about these issues and may feel kind of emboldened, especially employees who oppose DEI programming may feel emboldened by the administration's priorities in the current moment to kind of speak more openly about those positions inside the workplace. And really the intense polarization around the term DEI and the headlines are really just adding fuel to the fire around existing flashpoints that we've seen long before this administration around race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, and really kind of emboldening employees to be more aggressive about their personal views on those issues inside the workplace. We see those flashpoints often erupting in off-duty conduct. So, like I said, there's often these sort of blurry lines in today's environment. What's on duty versus off duty? What does it mean to be remote or hybrid? And, you're at work, but you're at home. And social media has, LinkedIn sort of increasingly is looking a little more like Facebook than it is like, a professional platform. And many coworkers or even subordinates and supervisors are linked on those social media accounts and seeing each other's content. Those are all ways that the conversation around DEI is really turning into flashpoints inside the workplace. Next slide. So I mentioned that religious discrimination and accommodation is an area of expertise for me, and something that I've been focused on for a couple decades now, but it really has become a very prominent issue in, say, the last 5 years in particular. So just wanted to spend a moment kind of talking about the flashpoints that we see in the religious space and how you might apply that flashpoints framework that we talked about when it comes to religion. So we're certainly seeing an uptick in religious discrimination and accommodation claims, as well as an uptick in requests for religious accommodation. Mainly those will arise out of Title VII, which is the federal statute that governs religious discrimination and accommodation, but also state law analogs. And there's certainly, have always been requests for religious accommodation, right? Even before the last 5 years, people might request not to work on the Sabbath, or to have prayer breaks, or to modify a grooming or attire policy because of their religious needs, say wearing a yarmulke with a uniform. But increasingly, we're seeing a different kind of trend in the requests. So rather than just prayer breaks, we're seeing a trend toward requests for dedicated prayer space, or whole dedicated prayer rooms. And sometimes arguments breaking out about sort of who can use those rooms, and how come there's, a prayer space for Muslim employees, but not for Christian employees, and requests for accommodations in connection with some of those disputes. Increasingly, we're seeing religious-based requests for exemption from diversity training, from Pride Month or other diversity initiatives. People saying, I can't, because of my religion, use my coworkers' preferred pronouns. And I don't want to go to discrimination training because it violates my religious belief. And obviously, a lot of those are really tricky because they pit different protected classes against each other. And so those need to be handled with a lot of sensitivity. We're seeing a lot of questions from clients around faith-based ERGs, employee resource or affinity groups, or sometimes called business resource groups. I think it's fair to say that many employers up until relatively recently had policies that said you just can't have an ERG that has to do with politics or religion, period, not allowed. And I think increasingly, a couple things are happening. One is that employees are increasingly requesting faith-based ERGs, whether that's kind of a general, non-denominational faith-based employee resource group for anyone of any religious belief, or requests for, for example, a Jewish ERG, particularly after October 7th, or Muslim ERG or Christian ERG. And I think that there's a good argument that there's increased legal risk in just flatly denying any religious ERGs if you're allowing them for example, race or gender or national origin. I would say I've had, probably 10 calls in the last 2 weeks just on that question of faith-based ERGs. We are litigating around the country requests or litigation arising out of requests for religious exemption from mandatory vaccination programs. I sometimes have people ask, like, that's still going on, but it absolutely is, because many clients still have mandatory vaccination programs, especially in the healthcare space. But even if clients have sort of sunsetted some of those programs or revised them, there's still litigation arising out of that's ongoing, rising out of those requests from maybe 2021 or 2022. We're also seeing a trend toward requests for training on about bias against specific religions. So employees requesting, for example, training about anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, sometimes wanting to bring outside groups in, like say the ADL, to provide an anti-Semitism training. We see lots and lots of litigation in this space. We know that the EEOC reported back during the Biden administration that there was an increase in charges having to do with anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, but increasingly we're seeing claims of anti-Christian bias, as well as, as I mentioned, the vaccination litigation. Next slide. And just in 2025, we have seen a lot of executive orders that have to do with religion. So as you'll see on the screen, one was called Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism. There was one about eradicating anti-Christian bias, and one about additional measures to combat anti-Semitism, as well as one about military members who had been discharged for non-compliance with a mandatory vaccination policy. And these just add fuel to the fire in terms of kind of energizing people to feel emboldened to request religious accommodations, to voice their religious views at work, even if those might come in conflict with other protected classes. And so, back to sort of the Flashpoints framework. So what do you do in this space? There's all these increase in requests and in litigation. So how do you find that Flashpoints framework to try to navigate through those thorny issues, even as executive orders are issuing, it seems like daily? And so again, we're looking at kind of what can your organization do in a proactive way to try to develop a program so that you're not reacting to each of these, but rather have a consistent and coherent set of principles and practices and policies that will help guide you through some of these flashpoints. So for example, do you have a religious accommodation policy? A lot of companies, in my experience, have really beautifully thought out disability accommodation policies and practices, but haven't really necessarily given as much thought to religious accommodation. And so having a written policy can help you just have that kind of structural framework so that when you get a request for, let's say, I don't want to use my coworkers' pronouns, you have a policy that you can go to as a starting point and as a framework. Do you have a religious accommodation request form? We find that that form is incredibly helpful for documenting what the employee is asking for, having them explain in a kind of free narrative way, what is their sincere religious conflict with a workplace rule? What are they asking for, exactly? What duration are they asking for? And having that document as a sort of starting point for the interactive process. And we have a form that we've created that we think works really well to start that process. Training. So anyone who comes into contact with religious accommodation requests, whether that's frontline managers, HR, business partners, people in the legal department, really should be trained in best practices for today's moment. So standard for religious accommodation claims changed in 2023 as a result of a unanimous Supreme Court ruling. And so everyone who intersects with these requests needs to understand that new standard. Really making sure that people understand the obligation to do the interactive process, that they know when someone is asking for a religious accommodation, sort of know what to listen for, and know who to escalate to. How do they find who that should be routed to, whether it's in HR or the legal department. You could consider a process map for religious accommodations. That's something that we've been helping clients with, and that we're seeing more requests for. So again, many employers will have that for a disability process, but not really for the religious process. And that can be a great way for establishing a really clear and consistent policy and process for handling those requests. You also can work with HR to draft talking points for the interactive process, because these are really tricky. These are really hard. And having your HR person, kind of empowered with some talking points that are within the guardrails, that have the appropriate sensitivity, is something that can really assist. We've developed a religious accommodation assessment tool, and we will, I think maybe it's already in the chat. So it takes 2 minutes to fill out, and you kind of get like an instant score on kind of where you are and where there might be some opportunities for improvement in your religious accommodation and discrimination practices. But that sort of gives you an example of how, if your internal stakeholders who are thinking through your Flashpoint strategy, rather than kind of panicking or reacting to each executive order, or getting a request for religious accommodation that hits on a flashpoint and kind of not knowing where to start, if you've given some thought to these kinds of policies and forms and approaches, then when you do get even a tricky request, you've already got kind of an infrastructure to handle that flashpoint. Next slide. And now I'm going to turn it over to Abby to sort of talk about, with that landscape, what should employers do now?
Thanks, Dawn. Yeah, so at this point, you really might be asking yourself, where do we go from here? We're living in this time of tremendous polarization, affecting the workplace, that's creating both legal and reputational risk for employers. And so this is where we go back to that customized framework that Dawn outlined earlier. And that involves taking a close look at that intersection between legal risk, your policies, your business needs and mission, as well as the need to attract and retain talent and keep employees engaged, and really arming yourself with a plan as to how to handle all of those intersecting factors. Legal considerations and the role of the lawyer are going to be playing a much bigger role now than 6 months ago, given the need for updated risk assessments with this unprecedented nature of this era, and the rapid pace of change across the legal landscape. Next slide, please. So first things first, we encourage institutions to develop their own internal Flashpoints task force. This involves engaging key stakeholders who will engage with proactive development of that customized framework that will mirror the needs and mission of your institution specifically. And then having that task force being there to apply that framework as Flashpoints arise in real time. Again, there's a lot of uncertainty, so this will allow you to be prepared to address new areas of uncertainty as they come up. Generally, clients have reported that having that internal task force has been really helpful in developing a comprehensive and thoughtful approach to Flashpoints. So who should be on this task force? First, always important to have legal and HR in the room. The lawyers will allow you to understand your legal options while also helping protect and insulate conversations with the attorney-client privilege. And HR is really going to be important to make sure that that framework is being applied in an effective manner on the ground as things are changing. You're, of course, going to want to loop in people that are in charge of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, as well as employee relations, particularly if you're dealing with a unionized environment. And your public relations folks, though the role of public relations is growing rapidly in importance in this era, we're seeing that the court of public opinion is in many ways at least as important as the court of law these days. So once your institution has decided how it wants to respond to these Flashpoint issues, the manner in which that response is communicated, both internally and externally, is going to be crucial, as that's really going to have one of the primary impacts on your reputation and the views and reactions of employees and customers, clients, and any other stakeholders. And this is particularly true with the recent rise in boycotts that we've been seeing. So you really want to make sure that you have PR and employee relations professionals present as much as possible. and ensuring that they are using the correct and nuanced language when messaging to employees and other audiences. And finally, Don touched on this a little bit earlier, but we're seeing an increased interest by corporate leaders to be more directly involved. So getting them aligned, particularly because you want any decisions that you're making to be consistent with the institution's core values, which is going to bring us to our next slide. So in developing a framework, you really want to take a step back and focus on what are your core values, your mission, your purpose. And that should really be driving the decision-making process when it comes to Flashpoints. With this era, there's a lot of semantics and nuances and language that can, sort of create perceived conflicts when there really aren't one, or when people are kind of on the same page in reality. So it's helpful to take that step back and ask, what are the things that we all agree on as a company? For instance, do we all agree that hiring and promotion should be based on objective metrics and not subjective assessments? Do we believe that the more transparent we are in hiring, promotion, and bonus decisions, the more incentive that you provide for your people to be delivering their all? And so really zeroing in on what those core values are going to help ground yourself while you're making these decisions and remain consistent when you're handling new situations as they arise. Next slide, please. So part of the process in developing this framework is obviously taking a close look at your policies. So first, seeing what policies do you already have in place and making sure that they remain lawful. When was the last time they were updated? And then also identifying what type of additional policies might help minimize polarization in the workplace. So for instance, your discrimination, harassment, EEO policies, when were these last updated? What types of changes have occurred since then that may warrant revisions to those policies? For example, has it been updated to address bathroom access or the use of pronouns in the workplace to the extent that you want to include those things in your policies? Do you have a policy addressing respect in the workplace? Could it be broadened given the things that are happening in today's landscape? Is it compliant with the National Labor Relations Act? Policies regarding political expression. So figuring out how much you as an institution want to limit advocacy or the types of topics that can be discussed in the workplace, or setting sort of guidelines around those conversations. Similarly, do you have policies governing how employees conduct themselves on social media? And are all those policies consistent with both federal and state laws in these spaces? Dawn also touched on the religious accommodation issue, obviously. So again, you might have a policy governing accommodations more generally, but does it really dive into religious accommodations and how you want to handle that? So making sure that your policies are not only aligned with legal obligations, but also with, again, your core values and mission, and really coming back to that. Next slide, please. So it's also important to look at where in your place flashpoints are erupting. So at your institution in particular, where are you seeing these issues? Sometimes a neutral policy and some guidelines around everyday workplace activities can really work wonders in bringing down the temperature in these areas. So for instance, if you use Jabber or Slack or any other platform for messaging, or on internal bulletin boards or intranets, are there fights breaking out on those platforms? And you might want to take a look at your policies and develop some guidelines that, make it clear that even though this is an informal format that you're using, it's still a work communication. You're still at work and you still need to be following workplace policies. So you may want to ask employees to stick to professional work topics only when they're using their platforms. Or you may want to make clear that they shouldn't be using those platforms to request donations to fundraising pages or things like that. Similarly, if you have outside speakers coming in and also using your platforms, and maybe they're coming in and instead of focusing on the topic at hand, they're talking about polarizing viewpoints about current events going on. And so one way to address that is to create some speaker guidelines and get those guidelines to the speaker ahead of time, have them sign it, and really just explain that you expect them to stay on topic, and reserve the right to end a program if it seems to be going off the rails a bit. Another area to look at is workplace uniforms and appearance guidelines. So ensuring neutrality in terms of the types of acceptable workplace clothing or accessories that can really help reduce conflict between employees. But again, make sure you're mindful of the need to accommodate certain types of clothing for religious reasons, as well as avoiding limiting speech through pins and hats and whatnot in a way that creates potential labor issues. And then finally, with all the remote work going on these days, it can really help to be proactive in setting guidelines for how employees interact on all these different virtual platforms. So making sure that if you are on a Zoom call, you're using an appropriate manner. For example, expecting employees to use a approved company background, or otherwise just making clear that you expect non-distracting settings when they're engaging at work, even though they're not physically in the workplace or it doesn't feel like they are. Next slide, please. So once you have all of these policies and guidelines in place, unfortunately, the work doesn't stop there. And what we're seeing with rapid changes in this new environment is the need for more periodic legal review and updated risk assessments to keep up with all of these issues. So it might feel like you just went through this whole process, and how can you need to be doing it again? But the idea is really to iron out a process that will leave opportunities for evolving risk assessments, as well as allowing for monitoring to ensure that thoughtful design is being implemented in a way that's lawful. Because ultimately your program is only as lawful as the manner in which individuals and decision makers are actually implementing that program on a day-to-day basis. So that this need for constant review and adjustments is really becoming the norm in this new environment. Next slide, please. One of the most critical aspects for managing Flashpoints is going to be training. When it comes to what the training should look like, we highly recommend live in-person training whenever possible. Online recorded training can often seem easier to implement, but it's likely going to be much less effective. People just, like to click through and go through the motions as opposed to actually engaging with and processing the content that they're seeing, which is really important when we're dealing with these sensitive issues like those at hand. So we really recommend having an engaging trainer who can get an interactive dialogue going with the audience and establishing clear boundaries during the training. Because one issue that can come up with a training or someone who isn't well equipped to be conducting such a training can be that it can create flashpoint issues in and of itself. So you want to be mindful that the content of the training that you're providing, the hypotheticals that they're using, that you're carefully vetting these to avoid, using stereotypes or characterizing groups of people in any way that could be offensive or otherwise create their own issues. And this has always been true, but is even before the recent executive orders, but is something you really want to focus on even more now. And this, again, goes back to what we discussed in the last slide in terms of conducting regular reviews and risk assessments and really continuing to vet and review your training materials to make sure that they're compliant. As far as who to train, you should be looking at training supervisors, hiring managers, HR professionals, recruiters, your legal department. And while the content will need to be reviewed and updated as things change, generally you'll be focusing on discrimination and harassment, maintaining a respectful workplace. As Dawn mentioned, religious accommodations is something really important to get training on at this time. And finally, if you are looking for assistance in ensuring that your training is timely and compliant, Seyfarth has partnered with Seyfarth at Work, which is a subsidiary of the firm, to develop a workforce training that covers general non-discrimination principles, but also touches on these Flashpoints issues that we've been discussing as well. And with that, I think I am handing it back over to Dawn.
Thanks, Abby. So we wanted to just spend a few moments talking about Flashpoints litigation and Flashpoints investigations, because litigation and investigations that touch on some of these sensitive and polarizing issues really are different and require a different and kind of specialized approach. So in terms of Flashpoints litigation, there's just a different risk profile in Flashpoints cases. There's a higher risk of an explosive verdict, for example, which is already a trend in employment cases generally. But a case that touches on these kinds of fault lines is going to affect a jury differently, right? Those jurors come into the jury box with strong views about these polarizing issues. There's certainly a higher risk for reputational harm for the institution and for individual defendants and executives, right? If an executive is giving a deposition in a case that focuses on one of these Flashpoints issues, the potential for soundbite that goes the wrong way, that becomes highly publicized, is obviously creates kind of a fraught situation. Flashpoints litigation tends to require specialized expertise, whether that's vaccine litigation, which is sort of a set of litigation unto itself that requires specialized knowledge about the pandemic, about the religious and disability accommodation standards, litigation arising out of religious rights versus LGBTQ rights, really requires specialized expertise beyond just typical employment litigation. Cases that arise out of the global conflicts such as the Israel-Hamas war or out of DEI initiatives require specialized expertise. These cases also often involve non-typical plaintiffs. Sometimes that means that you're actually litigating against the EEOC in an EEOC-initiated suit, which requires specialized knowledge of how that agency tends to prosecute cases, specialized knowledge about how they approach, ESI, for example, or sometimes it's a suit brought by a political or religious group. We see that often in the vaccine space, but increasingly in lots of different kinds of Flashpoints litigation. And those kinds of groups as plaintiffs really are kind of a unique animal because they're not, unlike typical plaintiffs lawyers in the employment space, they're not really motivated by money, and they're not willing to settle for money. The point of the litigation is to make a point and to get publicity and potentially to get to the Supreme Court and make new precedent. And so those just really are different from ordinary litigation against a typical plaintiff's firm. Even answering a Flashpoints complaint or briefing the issues requires special sensitivity because most of these pleadings are in fact public and will play out in the public sphere. You could easily see your case highlighted in the New York Times. For example, there was a recent lawsuit brought by Jewish students against an educational institution. And the court in that case issued a decision that said that the court was dismayed by the employer's suggestion that the Jewish students should have hidden upstairs or left the building. These events took place in 2023, not 1943. And Title VI places responsibility on colleges and universities to protect their Jewish students from harassment, not on those students to hide themselves away in a proverbial attic. That's just an example of some very tough language from a court that, of course, plays out on PACER. It's available to anyone, covered by reporters. And so there's just this dynamic of public content that speaks to these Flashpoints that is really just different in Flashpoints litigation. In a really interesting way, there's this need for the litigation team to be educated on whatever cultural issues are at play in that particular Flashpoints litigation. Obviously, that doesn't mean that you need to have a PhD in global conflicts. But it does mean that you need to have, whoever's litigating the case needs to have an understanding of the cultural, historical, political landscape that's at issue in the case so that you kind of understand where the landmines are and avoid missteps that may become publicized. I think the key with Flashpoints litigation is to defend the litigation without getting mired in the Flashpoint itself. That is easier said than done. But in a lot of these cases, really what we want to be doing is making the litigation boring, making it just an ordinary employment case, expressing to the court that this was a business judgment, that was made for these business reasons, and not kind of getting into actually litigating the polarizing and sensitive content in and of itself. And in order to do that, you really need to start at the charge stage and continue all the way through potentially a jury trial or an appeal, and have that kind of consistent narrative kind of taking down the temperature from the start. Next slide, please. We wanted to touch on Flashpoints investigations. This is a really important area to focus on, because we see that a lot of times when clients are calling us with Flashpoints questions, let's say they're saying, this employee came into the HR office, they had a screenshot of something that their coworker had posted online, and they're outraged, and they could have said this terrible thing about somebody in a protected class, and they want they want action taken immediately. Sometimes it's already gone public, and so you might have you hope not, but you might be on social media. You might have customers writing to you, or the public writing to you, demanding, how can you still employ this person when they've posted this terrible content online? One of the first things that we will often counsel clients is, well, have you investigated? Because until you do that investigation, you really don't know exactly what happened, right? Particularly in an age of deep fakes and AI, there really can be a lot of things going on, and you really want to make sure that you're dealing with the facts. We've had cases where something looked like it was an employee's social media account, but it was actually an impersonation, and they were actually the victim of an impersonation scheme. And so going back to those kind of core principles, which we would do in really any kind of report of violation of our anti-discrimination or harassment policies, to those basic principles of finding the facts. And just like specialized knowledge is needed for Flashpoints litigation, that's also true for Flashpoints investigation. So understanding the cultural moment, the landmines around some of these flashpoints, the import of particular words or phrases, and kind of what they mean in the cultural context is going to be really important to get right when it comes to doing a Flashpoints investigation. Because after all, you may be defending this investigation 5 years from now in litigation. And so you want to make sure you start from a foundation of selecting an investigator who is going to be the right fit for a Flashpoints issue and able to handle the investigation with the right sensitivity. Next slide. We certainly understand that this is a difficult time. It's a challenging and chaotic time for many employers. Wanted to offer that we are here as a resource to help. You could email Abby or me for a Flashpoints checklist that we've developed. We're helping clients to establish best practices, whether it's for DEI programs, ERGs, religious accommodations, or really any of the issues that we've discussed today. We work a lot with internal Flashpoints teams to help them. Sometimes we'll provide them with hypotheticals that we've seen come across from clients, and they'll kind of work those through with their internal team. We do a lot of training, whether that's with legal, HR, and executive teams, or broader workforce training, such as the one that Abby mentioned from Seyfarth at Work. That's a broad-based workforce training in navigating Flashpoints. We assist with auditing policies, defense, of course, with Flashpoints litigation, and expertise with investigations that touch on these issues. Next slide. So this is the CLE code for those who are seeking CLE credit, and the attendance verification code is SS4200. That's SS as in Seyfarth Shaw 4200. Next slide, please. And so just want to thank everyone for joining us today. Feel free to reach out to Abby or to me. Contact information is right there. I'm happy to continue this discussion or answer any questions. or be of service in any way that we can. Thanks so much.